Welcome to Spooky South Coast. Tim Weisberg here, along with Stephanie Burke, the silent assassin Matt Costa, and science advisor Matt Moniz. We are here to talk about the paranormal, as we are each and every Saturday night. Good evening and welcome to Spooky South Coast. Tim Weisberg here, along with the silent assassin Matt Costa. Stephanie Burke off tonight. Science advisor Matt Moniz off tonight. So you just got the original two, the classic hosts. The what would we call this? Spooky South Coast old school, or oh, how about I turn your mic on?
The gruesome twosome.
There we go. That works too. Although we do have a third party in the studio, so and she's not gruesome. Don't call her that, Matt. That's not nice. She's a guest. We have joining us in the studio is Darcy Lee. She is the author of Ghosts of Plymouth, Massachusetts, and we're going to be talking with her about that tonight. Good evening, Darcy. How are you?
I am well, thank you. Thank you for having me on this dreary, rainy evening. Perfect night for ghost stories.
It really is. I mean, if you're going to talk about strange and unusual topics, which is what we talk about here on Spooky South Coast, we talk about the paranormal each and every Saturday night. What better night can you ask for than this? And I say that with total gratitude in my heart that it changed over from snow to rain, because there's nothing worse than trying to drive home from the show at 2 a.m. in a snowstorm. So it's but it definitely does have a creepy feel tonight. I noticed that when I left the house. Actually, I was still in the house. It was probably like around 4 o'clock, 4:30 this afternoon, and I said, wow, it's really dark outside.
Very dark. Like
darker than it normally is during a storm.
Mm-hmm.
And even I turned the lights on in my house, and I just never felt like there was enough light. So maybe it was just Mother Nature setting the tone for tonight's show.
Most likely.
And if you want to join in with the program at any time, you can call in at 508-996-0500, 877-996-1420. Say hello right now to everybody in the chat room on SpookySouthCoast.com, on our YouTube channel, and on our Spooky South Coast app, which is free, by the way. If you don't have it, download it now, especially since I know a lot of folks are getting nice new devices for Christmas. You're giving me that look as if, like, don't mention the iOS.
Well, I was gonna say like only on Android for the time being.
For right now.
For the time being.
We have to. Should we tell the people what's up with the Apple app? Because a lot of people just went out and got the new iPhone X, and
it might still be up.
It might still work.
I don't have a. I don't.
Yeah, we don't buy Apple.
You're right. You're right.
We're smart. We're adults. We have Android. But there's an iPhone app too, an iOS app as well. But we haven't renewed our fee.
Our certificate, our Apple certificate.
Is that what it is? It's an Apple certificate,
right?
And it's how much?
$99.
$99 it costs for us to put that app up that we give away to you for free. And by the way, we don't have any money. We're broke. This show is we operate on spare change. That's why I'm so glad. I'm so glad that we're still grandfathered into that rate for our podcasting.
All right.
That we got in 2006. Actually, 2005.
Right. I think we built what
Hipcast.
We use Hipcast. Yeah. Yeah. We made them what they are today.
That and they hate us because we are locked into that rate. So they don't offer the unlimited bandwidth, unlimited storage plan anymore.
Right.
I don't know if that was like a special thing just to try to get people to use it back in 2006, but we signed up for it and now they can't do anything about it. Except I get really nervous sometimes when like the card expires. And like we don't go in there and change it. Yeah, we don't go in there and change it because I'm like, they're just looking for an excuse to boot us out at this point. Right. Make us pay the regular rates. But yeah, so anyway, this show operates on spare change. So we will eventually find a way to come up with $99 to renew that certificate. But until that point,
we'll probably have an update for the app soon.
Yeah.
I'll keep saying it and then I'll have to do it.
But if you get a Google phone, if you get the new Google phone that's coming out, because I know people that are excited for this Google phone. So if they get that, they should have no problem downloading the app, right? That just comes from the Android store.
Right.
So
you can also find us on Google Play as well. Google Music. Whatever music service Google has.
Yeah, you can find the Stitcher, up there. The Stitcher app.
Yep, iTunes.
Everywhere
and
yes,
we're all over the place.
We should point that out for anybody that's listening to the show that gets the show via iTunes. We should point out that fact that even though we haven't renewed our Apple certificate for our app to show up in the Apple Store, you can still get our podcast free from iTunes.
Right.
It's still up there. It's still hundreds of episodes. iTunes is kind of a pain. They only put up like what the most 100 most recent episodes.
Is it something like that?
Yeah, I don't think they have every episode, but we have archive feeds and all different ways to get every episode that we've ever done.
I know there's quite a few listeners on the TuneIn app, and I'm not exactly sure how far they go, but I know they go pretty far, and because I exchanged some emails with whoever's over there, and they've updated some of our information.
Well, that's good. I like the fact that we can kick this show out in a variety of different ways. Basically, it's like whatever you're into, we'll find a way to get the product to you. So, and if you have any ideas of how you want to consume the show, let us know. SpookyCrew@SpookySouthCoast.com. And I should mention, too, we also rebroadcast each week on the Dark Matter Radio Network as well. So anybody that's a fan of Art Bell, that's how that radio network was founded, was Art Bell and Keith Rowland founded that together. And
we get quite a few emails from people who discover us on Dark Matter Radio.
We have a huge following on Dark Matter, and we thank everybody for tuning in to us there or however you listen. And it's usually this time of year that we ask you, send us an email. Let us know who you are, where you're listening from, how you listen, and what you think of the show, any ideas, constructive criticism, because we do a lot of self-evaluating during the holiday time. When everybody else is out having fun and spending time with family and opening gifts and everything, we're sitting alone in the dark thinking about how much do we suck.
We spend a lot of time in the dark.
We do. That's all right, though. And it's better for our eyes, isn't it? No, it's worse for your eyes, right? It's worse. I think it's worse for your eyes.
Oh, man.
So, but we eat a lot of carrots, so we should be good. But so the idea is that, we're going to, as always, when we hit our anniversary in January, at the end of January, we start looking on ways to improve the show in the new coming year. So any suggestions that anybody has, we are willing to listen. 508, I'm sorry, I'm going to avoid the phone number to get people to call in with suggestions. Don't do that, because then we'll take it personally when we have to hear it over the air. Email them to us, SpookyCrew@SpookySouthCoast.com, and that's the way to reach us for anything that you want to let us know about. And it's also, the Spooky South Coast website is also a place where, you never know where you're going to find cool stories and cool different events that we do, different paranormal investigations that we do, different things that we're involved in. And one of the things that I'm involved in, and a lot of people out there listening have been to, is I do an evening of ghost stories and New England legends, which is our stage show that we do. It's myself and Jeff Belanger and Carl Johnson and Andrew Lake and the photography of Frank Grace. And we go out and we go to a theater, and Frank Grace takes these amazing photographs. We put them up on the big screen, and then the rest of us tell ghost stories to those photographs. And the idea is that it's almost like it's a ghost tour without you having to leave your seat. And last year, when we did it at the Company Theater in Norwell. And I try to, because we will tell some of the same favorite stories, and we will tell some new stories each time as well. And I try to pick stories that are geographically close to where it is that we're telling the story. And I thought Norwell last year was pretty close in proximity to Plymouth. So I actually told some Plymouth ghost stories on the stage show. But I only scratched the surface of some of these stories. And our guest tonight, Darcy Lee, is going to get us into some of the real in-depth stuff. And she has a book that she has written, Ghosts of Plymouth, Massachusetts. And it's from the History Press. So anybody that knows the History Press, you know you've got the creepy photo on the front with the giant moon in the background. And I know the location that's on the front cover of the book, but let everybody know where that is.
Sure. The cover of the book is a picture of First Parish Meeting House in Town Square in Plymouth. So right in the heart of the downtown area, and right next to and surrounded by historic Burial Hill.
And that is probably my favorite place to go. Like, I'm not even talking from a paranormal perspective. If I just have a nice day that I'm like, I think I'm going to go take a walk. Some people go to the beach. Some people want to go to the woods. I want to go to Burial Hill. And I want to walk around, look at all the graves, and then I want to kind of go through some of the downtown Plymouth haunts. And it doesn't matter if it's Halloween time. It doesn't matter if it's Thanksgiving. It doesn't matter if it's the middle of the summer. When you're walking through Plymouth, you feel that history as well as the paranormal stuff rubbing right up against you.
That's true. And Burial Hill is one of the best vantage points to see Plymouth Harbor. And if you put yourself in the place of the Pilgrims, right there on Burial Hill was where their original fort was. And so you can just imagine what they would have seen. And that vantage point was there for their protection. That's why they chose that particular spot.
And I don't know if you're like me, but I geek out at things like that. To be able to stand in the same spot, that William Bradford stood in, to know that I'm standing amongst where, some of the first pilgrims stood and watched to see where the Native Americans were coming from, to see other ships coming in as the years progressed. This was such an important spot that you can feel it when you're up there.
You certainly can. And I was just up there the other day and walking through the pathways that generations of people have walked, either in grief or in fear or in depression or desperation. You can really feel that up there as well.
And one of the best parts about it is when you are there, it's almost like laying out chronologically the history of Plymouth before you, because you see all the important names. You see all the names going all the way back to the Mayflower, but then all the names that have been important in that town since. And I spent a good number of my years in my youth going to school in Plymouth. I lived in Plymouth. And these are still family names that are in town today and still carry a lot of weight.
That's correct. And some very famous people are buried up on Burial Hill as well. I make it a point when I'm there to visit the grave of Mercy Otis Warren, who was so instrumental in Revolutionary era politics in the 1770s. So it's important to me to recognize the history of those people when I'm in a place like that.
And I don't know if chronicling ghost stories is one thing. I don't know if you actually do any paranormal research yourself. Have you done any investigating up there? Any recordings? Or?
Well, I'm not hardcore like you guys are, right? I look at it more from a historical perspective. For me, I lived and worked in the historical community in Plymouth for about 12 years. And I heard so many different stories, and I wanted to know, are they true? Is it true that a little girl ghost named Abigail Townsend actually haunts the Spooner House? who is the Victorian couple, speaking of Burial Hill, who is the Victorian couple that so many have seen walking up and down a pathway to a particular grave, and then they disappear, and then they walk down the pathway? Who are they, really? So for me, I like to tie the stories, the folklore, the legends to the actual history and do the research in finding out, were these real people? Could it be likely that they would have been alive or involved in something that would put them in that place and time? I mentioned Mercy Otis Warren, and her house is on the corner of North Street and Main Street. There's a haunting there of Captain James Warren, who built the house. There's a story in the book that's covered that. So for me to be able to tie the real people, incidents, events, activities to something that is quite possibly paranormal, that's what's really interesting to me.
And that's what I love about doing the work that we do, is because we have the opportunity then to actually communicate with these people, if that's what it is that we're doing. I mean, we're kind of operating on faith a little bit to say that when we capture a recording, it's a recording of a ghost, and that is the ghost of the person that we think that we're talking to. But if you take all that at face value, I went up to Burial Hill, I think it was probably it's either my first or second trip, and I'm sorry to say that I've only recently been going there, like the last couple of years. Even though I lived there for many years, it was just not a place that we went to. And I was walking around with my phone, and I was doing some recordings, and I was at the grave. The oldest grave is, I'm trying to think of his name. But anyway, near that grave, there is the grave of one of the Mayflower couples. I think it's the Howlands.
Howlands.
Yes. And so I was at the Howland grave, and I turned on my recorder, and I was just trying to communicate and seeing if anybody was there. And I captured the sound of a woman singing. And I know that I'm up on a hill, and that sound would probably travel if I, but still, this was like it was right next to me, and there was nobody else around. And then I walked over to William Bradford's monument, and I'm just in awe of that. Anyway, to William Bradford, I mean, come on. And so when I'm standing there, I decided to do a recording and speak to him as well, and I got a voice coming back and telling me good day. So I was pretty impressed with that for my first trip, and I was like, well, I'm gonna stick with those. Those are good enough for me. I'm not gonna keep pushing, and I went home and I played it for people, and some people heard it, and some people said I don't really hear it, but it was meant for me. That's the way that I look at it.
Yes.
And some of these stories, that's what happens is, a lot of these people who are working, working in the historical community, there's a lot of people that don't want to believe these stories.
Right.
And then there are others who are hoping that they're true, just so, imagine if you've studied this person your entire life and then you have the chance to actually talk to them.
Right.
So I always find it funny that, the historical community doesn't jump all over this. Not only because it's a good way to keep the past alive, but it's kind of a good moneymaker when tourism just isn't what it used to be. Plymouth is lucky in the way that, there'll always be tourists coming in at least once a year. They can guarantee a big influx of people coming in. But, you look at places like some of these smaller museums, the heritage museums, they're not bringing people through the doors. The biggest day they have all year is when the 5th graders walk over from Nathaniel Morton. That's pretty much that's the extent of it.
Well, I think too that learning and knowing the stories of our past is very, very important. And when you think about ghost stories and folklore and legend, they're very human stories. And they're human stories because what people believe they are seeing, apparitions of dead people, those were human beings who had energy and lived a life and had feelings and experiences themselves. And then the person who is witnessing the haunting, it's a very human story for them because they feel that energy, they feel that whatever is coming through, and it's something that is really happening to them. So I think it's important to know the history behind those stories. And for me, I wanted to not only verify that the ghost stories that I heard could possibly be true, but I also wanted to debunk some too as well. Because that's important to me, that if the stories that are being told and are kept alive aren't true, then that's an injustice to our history, to our social history in particular.
I mean, it is, but also if a good urban legend can develop too, I mean, I think that can have a place. So it's one thing if you're the person that's going out to experience this, maybe taking a ghost tour, maybe, reading the book, maybe going out there and exploring these places on your own. If you can have a separation in your own mind of what can be historically proven and what is just a story that people tell, those stories can also kind of take on a life of their own too.
I would agree with that too, because there's a reason why stories stick around and why they're told. And I made it a hobby of mine when I was in a job where I traveled a great deal. And I always, since I was a child, had an interest in the paranormal and the unexplained and history and legend. So I made it a hobby of mine. Whenever I was in a different city or a different state or wherever I was across the country or overseas, I would find a bookstore and pick up a book about local ghost stories. And I now have a very large collection of books of local ghost stories, because to me, those stories that stick around, as you said, Tim, there's a reason why they do and why people hold on to that particular urban myth, legend, folklore, history. There's a reason to that, and trying to explain what may have happened in the past in today, present day. So I think that's part of some of it's superstitions or adding legend to a place or an activity. So it is interesting. I do think that in some ways it does have its place.
And one of the weird things about Plymouth and its ghost stories is that, at least, growing up there and being into ghosts, even when I was a young kid, you didn't hear a lot about the ghost stories there. There wasn't a lot of books like yours. And in fact, the only ones that I can think of that are even similar to yours are the books that Ed Lodi wrote.
Yep.
But Ed Lodi's books weren't, going out and exploring modern hauntings as much as they were taking some of the older writings that shared ghost stories and bringing them back into the present. So there's, this is the first chronicling that I can think of that's been the modern ghost stories of Plymouth.
Yes, and that is indeed why I wrote the book, because here I had traveled around the world and collected ghost story books, and I arrived in Plymouth about 12 years ago, took on a job in the historical community, wanted to get a ghost story book specifically wholly dedicated to Plymouth, and there wasn't one. Yet I was hearing all these stories, either by the tours that happen. There are ghost tours in Plymouth. Colonial Lantern Tours was one. There's Spirit of Plymouth walking tours with historically dressed characters giving tours and telling, the different legends of the town. And so this gathering of stories, I wanted to be able to connect it back to something from the past and something real and share it with others. And I think it's important too, right now with Plymouth, Plymouth is going to be the centerpiece of an historical celebration in 2020, where it's the 400th year, the 400th anniversary of the landing of the Pilgrims. And so I think it's important to have a like what I've done with my book, a chronological history of legend, folklore, and ghosts available to the public, because I know there's an interest.
I mean, and obviously, chronologically is one thing. So I don't want to know the oldest ghost story that you know of from Plymouth, but what is the first ghost story that you remember hearing about Plymouth?
One of the first ghost stories was the one that I mentioned about Abigail Townsend, the little girl ghost who supposedly haunts the Spooner House on North Street. It was said that Abigail Townsend was a child who passed away from an abscessed tooth. Do we know if she ever lived in the house? Most likely not. I did the research behind that. But the stories have her peering out the upstairs window, skipping rope in the alleyway, letting workmen, when there was a restoration done on the house, letting workmen into the house so that they could do their work when no one else was there. So there's lots of different stories. Also, she purportedly followed one of the tour guides home one night when they were talking about her. She followed them, that she would attach herself to them. There really isn't any evidence, as I mentioned, that she ever lived in the house or even visited the house.
But you have found record of an Abigail Townsend.
We have found record of a Elizabeth Townsend, who would have been about the same age, who could have visited Plymouth, but then her death record is in Worcester. Now, we also know with records of that time period that if you were born in a certain place or died in a certain place, you weren't always registered in the proper place or during the proper time period. So it could be that she was there. The other thing is, too, when we think about ghosts and things that stick around, we think about the land and other ways that they could be attached to a certain location. And that could be, too. She could have been someone who was in a neighboring place. There was this, I should mention, too, that this Elizabeth Townsend, Abigail, Elizabeth, same sounding names. Those names were brought through during a seance at the house. That she did pass away from mumps. So the swollen face, when people have reported that they've seen a girl who has a swollen face, she had an abscessed tooth, mumps would make sense in that regard. So it's close. But also a psychic did say that that house is haunted by 2 ghosts. I spoke with someone and interviewed them for the book, and they are convinced that it is haunted by one of the men in the descendancy of the Spooners who lived there, and that his portrait hangs on the wall.
See, now if I'm remembering my geography right, the Spooner house is right next to the library, the old original library.
That's correct.
And that's where I would go to the library when I was a kid growing up in Plymouth, and that library was definitely haunted. There was definitely something in there. And then the Mayflower Society has their headquarters there as well. And that also has rumors of there being a haunting in there as well. So maybe there's just something about the energy of that entire street that, and you're still pretty close to Coles Hill over there too, which is where all the first pilgrim bodies are.
That's correct. Coles Hill, very close to it, the first burial ground of the pilgrims. And over the course of about 150 years, pilgrim bones were being washed out from that area. They were collected, put in a sarcophagus, originally above the Plymouth Rock when the original portico was built, and now they are up atop Coles Hill, and I do have a picture of the sarcophagus that holds the pilgrim remains now.
That's fascinating. And you know what else is funny about Plymouth, and people always, you know, I have friends that come from all over the country that come and want to visit Plymouth, and we talked about, you know, what stories are true, what stories are just legend, and what stories are historically accurate, and kind of a lot of Plymouth is built on a myth, because people go there thinking that that's the actual rock.
Right, that's the rock that Mary Chilton first stepped on, a 13-year-old pilgrim girl, but it's symbolic. It's a symbolic rock of when the pilgrims arrived. There is a story about someone who knew one of the pilgrims, and he told the story about that was the first place that they stepped on. So legend, lore, makes for a good story.
I always thought it was convenient that they stepped right out on the rock that already said 1620 on it. So that worked out well.
Right.
Well, the Abigail story is you know, that's something that sticks with people all the time, because, you know, ghost stories about kids, they kind of stick with people, and it means something beyond just being your typical ghost story. It kind of hits you in the heart a little bit more when it's a child, especially a child who dies of something that we think of now as being, you know, 20 minutes in a dentist chair and a little penicillin and you're fine. But for back then, it was a life-threatening thing. there's a lot of stories, ghost stories from Plymouth that are like that, that are that kind of play on the heartstrings a little bit. And one of the stories that always kind of gets to me, especially because it is historically true and because it connects so much to the history when you go up to Burial Hill or when you go to the courthouse, and that being the General Arnold. And that I can't imagine what that was like for the townspeople to watch the suffering that went on with that.
Horror and suffering. I mean, just tragedy. So the Brigantine General Arnold was a ship that was traveling from Boston and passing through Plymouth, but got caught in a blizzard. They called it the Christmas blizzard of 1778. They were trapped in the ice in Plymouth Harbor, about a mile off of shore. It was a terrible 3-day affair. The blizzard lasted that long. The townspeople could hear the crew. There were 103 crew members on the General Arnold. They could hear the crew screaming in pain and agony. They were located just off of Brown's Bank. If people are familiar with Plymouth Harbor, sort of between Brown's Bank and the Gurnet Lighthouse. There was nothing that the townspeople could do to save the crew of the General Arnold. The General Arnold crew themselves cut down masts to try to make the boat lighter so that it could move through what was then becoming very frozen ice, but it wouldn't budge at all. So the legend is that Captain James McGee, who was the captain of the Brigantine General Arnold, the legend is that there was rum on board, that they were transporting rum. And he said to the crew, "Don't pour the rum down your throats, pour it into your boots, because then they wouldn't freeze to death, their feet wouldn't freeze. And by consuming alcohol, you're lowering your body temperature and they would freeze to death quicker." So half the crew, 70 members of that crew passed away. They froze to death. And there are gruesome details that I was able to draw out of an eyewitness account by Dr. Thatcher, a well-known doctor in Plymouth at the time. They were able to, after 3 days, basically walk out onto the harbor over what he described as an ice bridge and bring back the bodies to Plymouth Center. The bodies were laid out in the 1749 courthouse at Town Square on the same floorboards that are there today. And they were laid out so that family and friends could identify the frozen corpses.
And not to get particularly gruesome, but didn't they kind of have to wait for them to thaw just so they could get them in a position to put them into a coffin?
They did, and to pry them off of the ship as well. And in my book, I share what Dr. Thatcher wrote about what he witnessed, the gruesomeness and the grotesque poses that some of them were stuck in time. Some of the sailors were not claimed. Now, there is a ghost story that says, that's reported in town, that on cold nights you can hear screams of agony coming from Brown's Bank, and also someone is knocking on the windows of the courthouse from the inside. Blue faces. It could be. I've been at that courthouse at night, and it's definitely an and I've been inside, and even inside you can feel that eerie, ominous sense of it. And then of course there's the monument to those sailors up on Burial Hill, and the captain didn't die with them. He did not. Captain James McGee lived for a number of years after that, and he was known to go visit the graves of his 70 sailors that passed. So the legend is that the crew of the General Arnold haunts 3 locations in Plymouth: Brown's Bank, the 1749 courthouse, and Burial Hill. And that figure is John McGee. looks like him. When people have seen the apparition, it looks like he looked, and it would most likely be him visiting his crew.
And he was buried there with them.
He was buried there with them.
He asked when he died to be put with the crew.
He did. Yep.
And what I love too about some of these stories is it shows that as a community, even going all the way back to the time of the Pilgrims, there was that sense of community amongst the people of Plymouth. So even, it doesn't matter, you were still one of them. Yes. Even if you were somebody that was passing through and just spending some time, that you became one of them. And that's why I think these ghost stories are so great, because this is a community that's never going to let those go.
Right. They're part of the fabric of the community. They're a part of the history of the community. You know, a lot of people think of Plymouth as just the Pilgrim story. And it's so much more than that. It's a 400-plus year history. Now remember, when the Pilgrims arrived in 1620 in Plymouth, they had their own arduous journey to get here. They arrived to a place where for thousands of years prior, the Native American Poconokeets, the Wampanoag Poconokeets, had lived in Plymouth in what they called Patuxet, land of the Little Falls. 2 years prior to the Pilgrims' arrival, that Patuxet tribe was decimated by plague. There was only one that survived, and it was Squanto, because he had been away. He was actually kidnapped and was enslaved and was later returned to Plymouth. So when the Pilgrims arrived, they arrived to a place where the last of the Native Americans of that area died of plague and fell on the ground. They arrived to bleached bones on the ground. So from its very beginnings, we know just tragedy, desperation, decimation, plague, fear, depression. We know that that's what the Pilgrims arrived to.
And the story, you know, the story that we all learn in second grade or whatever, or even your kindergarten Thanksgiving pageant, whenever it is that you start learning about the Pilgrims, the story is that, you know, the Pilgrims arrive, they meet Squanto, Squanto helps them, all the Native Americans are so happy to have these new neighbors and everything's great, but that's not the case at all. I mean, from the minute, the Pilgrims weren't the first settlers that the Poconokeets had encountered, and they had very much a lot of reason not to trust them and not to want anything to do with them. And that was a very tense situation for a long time. And even Squanto isn't this benevolent being. He was playing both sides against each other. So there was a lot of kind of negative energy coming into this community right from the beginning.
That's correct. But what the Pilgrims and Massasoit did was they did forge a peace treaty that was kept with the Wampanoags and the Pilgrims for 50 years until King Philip's War. And ironically, King Philip was the son of Massasoit and ended up having his seat with the Narragansetts in Bristol, Rhode Island. He ended up finally in Plymouth with his head on a stake in Town Square. So there's a great deal of irony with that, and I think a great deal of disappointment, and that story just makes me feel as if in just one generation the lines of communication were broken down. So much had changed from what the Pilgrims and the Wampanoags had established.
I do think part of that, though, is that as Plymouth began to thrive as a colony, and as more and more settlers came over, you had a different group there, a group that didn't have the same ties to the Native Americans, that didn't have a symbiotic relationship with them. And so they're coming in, treating them as if they're lower class citizens, and trying to take take their people and convert them into Christians, and the so-called praying Indians, so they're coming in, and instead of saying we need to coexist alongside of each other, they're coming in and saying, well, now there's more of us than there is of you, and we're taking over.
That's correct. And remember too, I do describe an event in the book that happened where the Pilgrims on the side of the Wampanoags were made known that there was going to be that the Massachusetts Indian tribe was going to come down and take over and massacre the old colony, the Plymouth colony. So they were made known of that, went on a surreptitious trade mission up to Wessagusset and actually massacred the leaders of the Massachusetts that were going to come down and decimate them. They brought one of their leaders, his name was Weedham Woomat. They brought his head back from Wessagusset and planted it on a stake in town square. Again, flew the linen that his head was carried in, the blood-stained linen, as a flag, and it flew over the wedding of Governor Bradford and his wife, his new wife.
See, people think that, when somebody has a, do not trespass or beware of the dog sign in their yard, they think that's unfriendly. You think that's bad. The head on the spike was, far worse than, the doorbell with the camera in it.
That's correct. And remember, the Pilgrims were coming from England by way of Holland, but it was not unusual that heads were put on stakes outside of London, on London Bridge, right? It
always, in all the, again, let me start this off with a little bit of a caveat. Until we started doing this show in 2006, I had never even heard of King Philip's War. Mm-hmm. And I went to school in Plymouth, and they didn't teach us about it because it was such a buried thing. It's come to light in recent years. I think Nathaniel Philbrick has helped with a lot of that, and some of the other works that have come out. But it was a story that we kind of kept buried for a long time because in this story, the white people were wrong. So I didn't really know about it growing up. So I learned all that I learned through doing this show. So everything is coming at me from a bit of a paranormal lens, but it was actually kind of a supernatural element that led King Philip to decide to actually go to war with the colonists when there was that eclipse. And that was kind of what he saw as the sign of, we need to do this.
That's very interesting.
It's everything about it is just so, from finding John Sassamon frozen under the ice in the pond, like everything sounds almost like it's almost like a horror movie built around a war.
It is a horror movie, and really it's one of the most important periods of our history that, as you said, Tim, we don't know too much about. King Philip's War, there was an incident that happened in Plymouth, the Clark's Garrison House, which was located in what is now part of Plymouth Plantation, where the coach bus parking is and where there's part of the livestock display. That's where the Clark's Garrison House sat. And if there was any warning that there was going to be some skirmish in the area, the townspeople would go to Clark's Garrison. Well, there was a skirmish, and that skirmish ended up turning into a massacre. And 11 people, many of them women and children, were massacred by the Native Americans during King Philip's War in 1676. And that's a story that hasn't really been told in Plymouth, but an important part of the history, given those ties to King Philip, Massasoit, the Pilgrims, when just, 50 years later, there was such unrest in the colony.
It's funny because I think it wasn't until I read Philbrick that I really kind of understood the severity of the way that it went. I thought it was, if the colonists could drive the natives away from the colony, that was good enough. I didn't realize that they were following them and hunting them down. And even when they said, okay, fine, we'll leave you alone, we'll go somewhere else, they still tracked them down and killed them wherever they found them. So that's why when people say, I think my house is haunted because I think my house is built on an Indian burial ground, I always say everywhere around here is an Indian burial ground.
That's correct. That's correct. And, I mentioned before that, what the Pilgrims arrived to with the bleached bones of the Poconokeets on their land. There isn't a spot in southeastern Massachusetts, South Shore Massachusetts, Cape Cod, all of New England that hadn't seen or felt something of this war, right? And particularly in our area. So I think that that's important for people to remember. And sometimes land holds on to energy, land holds on to tragedy, just like houses or objects or people even.
I mean, I definitely want to get into some deeper questions tonight, and I don't know if it's a good idea to ask deeper questions when we're about 10 minutes away from having to take the news break, but I will ask this. It's a debate that happens all the time when we talk about the Bridgewater Triangle. And when we talk about the hauntings and the strange happenings in this entire southeastern Massachusetts area, but we talk about the tragedy of King Philip's War and everything that went on, and even before that, just the amount of death that happened and the tribulations of the pilgrims and all of that. And it's a chicken and an egg thing. Do we think that a lot of that stuff has left a stain on the land, or is this land already cursed? And that was actually why things were maybe a little bit harder than they needed to be.
Well, I ask that question in my book. Is Patuxet cursed? Cursed Patuxet.
I mean, it seems like it could be to me.
It seems like it could be to me too.
And before we forget, because I want to mention this a couple times throughout the show, but the reason why this worked out perfect to have you in tonight is you're actually going to be in town again tomorrow for a book signing.
I am. I'm going to be here in Fairhaven at the Beautiful Collective's Holiday Fair at the Seaport Inn, 110 Bridge Street. I'll be there from 11 to 4 signing books.
Did they tell you that the Seaport Inn is haunted?
I think I've heard that.
There's one particular room. They try not to let anybody into it, but there is one particular room. And speaking of haunted rooms and hotels, I'm sure that you probably covered it either in the book or just in your research, but the Bradford and the John Carver Inn.
The John Carver Inn
is it 4?
The third floor.
Okay.
It's on the third floor. Some people say it's a room in the 320s. Some people say it's room 309.
309 is, I think, the one that I heard, because when we were doing the stage show, Frank Grace and I went to Plymouth for him to take some photos for the show, and we said, let's see if we can get them to let us go into go take pictures of the room. And we were like going back and forth, like, they're not going to let us in. Maybe they will. Maybe they will. So finally we just decided to walk in and lean forward over the counter and say, hey, listen, we're doing a stage show about ghost stories. We want to just go take, and the people working there had never heard the story, but they said, if you're just going to go take a couple pictures of the door, sure, I guess it's okay. And they let us go and do it. But I know people that have said they've stayed in that room and will never go back.
Well, in my book is the story of someone who did stay in a room next to it and asked to be moved. The stories surrounding the hauntings at the John Carver Inn involve televisions that go on and off by themselves, water spigots in the bathrooms going on and off by themselves, clocks flashing going on and off by themselves. But it's not just the rooms or that particular third floor that's supposedly haunted. It's also the kitchen of the John Carver Inn, where some staff people have experienced very energetic spirits where they'll throw a pan across the room. One incident in particular that was described to me was on a Christmas day, on Christmas morning. And so I don't know, but I think the entire hotel could be haunted. It's built on land that was cleared during urban renewal. So there were many, many 17th century houses that were there until the 1960s. So that's a whole, I cover all.
I don't want to give away too much stuff from the book, but yeah. Do you pinpoint where the legend of those hauntings might have come from?
Yes, I do.
So I think you know what I'm alluding to?
I think I do know.
That's a creepy story.
So Dr. Thatcher, I mentioned him before. He was the physician that was on hand during the terrible tragedy of the Brigantine General Arnold. He also owned a house that was on Thatcher Street in Plymouth. And the story goes that there were medical students who lived in another house that would have been on the site of the John Carver Inn. And they needed to do experiments to learn about anatomy and to learn about the body and to be better doctors. They were learning at this point in their careers that they would, the story goes that they would go to Burial Hill and grave rob.
And that was actually a pretty lucrative profession back then, because people think that they would go up and steal the jewelry or whatever, but the bodies are where the money was at, because of medical students needing fresh corpses to work on.
Yep. They needed fresh corpses to work on. So they could have been in a house. I was not able to find in my research that there truly was a house where medical students lived. And, in the 1700s they were doing this. That's the legend. And it might make sense because Dr. Thatcher lived there.
I call it the Liberty Valance effect. When the legend becomes fact, print the legend.
That's right.
And think about that story next time you're having breakfast at the hearth and kettle. So there with your cup of coffee, eating your eggs, and all of a sudden, you hear something crash. What was that? It's probably the ghost of one of those bodies that was taken from Burial Hill. Well, we only have about 5 minutes left before we have to take a break for the news. Again, the phone numbers are 508-996-0500, 877-996-1420. When we come back after the news, we'll get into some more of these Plymouth ghost stories. We'll talk about your travels, too, and all these other places that you've been to. I'm very interested in finding out some of these other places you've had a chance to check out. And I'll just mention really briefly before we go into the break that, as I mentioned, I went to school there as a kid. I started going to West Elementary School, and then when I hit 5th grade, they had to start going to Nathaniel Morton. So I'm going, in the 80s, West was still a pretty modern school, and I go from this nice, happy little community school type place to all of a sudden I'm put into this federal style building that it looks, for anybody that's never seen it, it looks like the school from A Christmas Story, complete with the flagpole out front and everything. But that place was haunted. I can swear to you that place was haunted. I was on the top floor in my 5th grade classroom, and we had access to the attic area, and I would sneak up there just like in the Never-Ending Story, and there was a lot of stuff just going on in that building. But I'm not surprised, because you're right there on the water where people have lived for hundreds of years.
That's correct. And thousands of years, as we mentioned, with the Native American population. I have heard, too, that it's haunted. I didn't cover it in my book. I was chock-a-block full with stories already. And that
and
could
every
be
kid thinks their school is haunted.
Yes. Yeah.
But it was always great because we used to have to go to the basement. That's where the cafeteria was. Mm-hmm. And so you'd go down to the basement and you'd have your lunch. And you didn't want to be the last kid walking up the staircase going back to the classroom, because you just always felt like something was following you from the basement down there. So definitely a creepy place. So if any kids are listening that go to school there now, they're like, I don't want to go to school Monday. That guy said it's haunted.
But it's sort of like when you think about the John Carver Inn and being haunted, maybe it could be that thousands of people have passed through the John Carver Inn. Who knows what kind of baggage they're bringing with them in addition to their luggage. And the same with schools. Thousands and thousands of children have passed through that school, as well as teachers.
And I always say, you don't have to have tragedy to happen for it to leave a piece of your energy behind. Everywhere we go, we leave a piece of ourselves. And if the factors are right, maybe somebody else can experience that piece later on. It doesn't even mean that it's our ghost. It just means it's a bit of energy that we've left behind. So so we'll talk about more coming up in the next hour. 508-996-0500, 877-996-1420. Those are the numbers to call in. You can also jump into the chat room, and I'm sorry if I've been ignoring the chat room. I'm sure there's a bunch of questions in there. Are they still doing that thing, Matt, where they put the questions in capital letters?
Yes.
Okay, so if you have some questions that you want to ask in there, we'll try and make sure that we get to them between Matt and myself. We'll keep an eye on it and see if we can get into those coming up in the next hour as well. Just a little bit of a plug for some of our stuff coming up, just to let everybody know. We still have some tickets left for our 2 upcoming events. We have our Lizzie's March to Murder at the Lizzie Board and Bed and Breakfast coming up on March 3rd, 2018. We have probably about 8 or 10 tickets left for that. If you're looking for a Christmas gift that you want to give somebody, that something unique and different, something beyond just a regular gift certificate to go out to dinner or something like that, you can get tickets to that event. And also we have coming up October 13th, 2018, the the Parson Barnard House in North Andover, Massachusetts, on the 300th anniversary of Thomas Barnard's death, the exact day. the 300th anniversary of his death, we are going to be holding what we're calling the exoneration, where we will try and clear the Reverend's name from being associated with the Salem witch trial. Well, he was associated with the Salem witch trials, but the story is that he was one of the accusers and that he was going after people and putting them on the stand and accusing them of being witches, when in all actuality, it seems like the research that's being done there is that he was working to try and end the witch trials, and that somehow his name got lumped in with Cotton Mather and got lumped in as one of the accusers. So we're calling it the exoneration because we are trying to clear his good name. So we'll be doing that on October 13th, 2018. There's still tickets for that available as well. If you want to go to either of these events or any of the events that we hold, you can go to SpookySouthCoast.com on the events page there. While you're on the website, sign up. Sign up for alerts. It alerts you when we put up a new event. It alerts you when we go live with the show, right, Matt? We get live.
Yep.
So there's, and you never know what we're going to be throwing up there. We have a lot of ideas coming up for the upcoming year. There's going to be all kinds of stuff that we throw up on the site without any kind of announcement. So you're going to want to be part of that.
Right. We're talking a lot about adding some extra content for a lot of people out there.
Yeah.
But this year we might actually do it.
So subscribe. That's all I can tell you. And of course, you'll get on our mailing list as well. So we're going to take a break right now for the news. When we come back, we'll talk more about the ghosts of Plymouth with our guest Darcy Lee, and more Spooky South Coast coming up. Welcome back. Hour number 2 of Spooky South Coast. Tim Weisberg here, along with the silent assassin Matt Costa, science advisor Matt Moniz, and Stephanie Burke, both off tonight. They will. I think they'll probably both be back next week. I think Stephanie will.
Yeah, I think so.
Moniz is very busy this time of year, so we'll
Right,
see.
being Krampus.
Is that what it is?
I think so.
Is that
Yeah.
he didn't tell me exactly what he was doing, so
Keeps it under wraps.
I don't blame him. Well, you don't want to get that. You don't want that out of the bag. But we are here talking about the paranormal, and we're talking about the ghosts of Plymouth, Massachusetts tonight with our guest Darcy Lee. She's here with us in the studio. Before we get back into the discussion, we have a few thank yous to give over the break there, over the news. We want to say thank you to Anna, who came in with some Christmas candies for us that I should have not mentioned on the show because now Stephanie and Moniz are going to know when we don't share.
Right.
I'm just kidding. We're going to share with them.
We'll just be like, Moniz and Stephanie, Anna brought us a half a box of chocolates.
She brought you each a chocolate.
Right. She's like, all these have bites out of them.
Well,
Wonder how that happened.
because we had to figure out which ones were the ones with the
That's right.
the raspberry
That's right.
filling.
You have to.
Because those are what you like,
Those
right?
are
Those
those are the garbage ones.
no, they were all good. Those Russell Store, those are all good. We want to say thank you to her, and we want to say thank you. He probably doesn't want us to mention his name, but we got to say thank you to somebody in the chat room who just helped us out huge with a holiday donation.
Right,
so,
of course. Professor Eric.
I was gonna not mention his name.
Well, I thought you were just gonna.
No, I
Well,
said-
he did say it in the chat.
Oh, did he?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Professor Eric, for that very generous donation that we will use to immediately get the iOS store taken care of, and we'll have the app back up for people. Do you almost feel now like we need a better app?
Maybe the pressure's on now.
You made a great app, Matt. You made a great app. Not bad for being your first time.
Right, exactly.
Although I really wish we had see, we should have made the iPoop app. We talked about it for years, and now it's
Yeah,
huge.
Yep.
See, and if we had just done it, there's so many apps that we came up with ideas for that we just never followed through on that people are going to steal from us. Remember when I wanted to have that business where I just drove fast food to the people at the UMass dorms?
Oh yeah, is that a thing now?
Oh yeah, it's a
What is
huge business now. Yeah, and Uber does it.
Oh,
Uber
really?
has Uber Eats where
What?
they'll bring you food delivery.
Man,
See? And I was going to do this with like a 1980s Zach Morris cell phone
yeah.
and some flyers at UMass Dartmouth.
I don't know if I would get fast food delivered though. Like, I don't know, like McDonald's fries. Not to call them out by name, but they have like a 3-second shelf life. Then they turn ice cold. So I got to eat them all at once. You just shove as many fries as
We should.
in your mouth
We
at
have
once.
to let Darcy in on this.
Oh, I
There's always a
apologize.
portion of the
We
show.
just talk about food.
Yeah, where we just talk about food. It's never planned. It's not
Right.
supposed to happen that way, but it's a rabbit hole we fall down every week.
We get the hungry horrors.
But
That's right.
McDonald's now also offers. Have you seen this now? What they do? They offer a basket of fries.
A basket of fries.
So instead of just buying like a small, medium, large,
Right.
supersized, all that stuff, you can buy a basket of fries like you would if you went to like Cool Cone or something. So you buy this like basket of McDonald's fries, and I'm like, but they get cold when it's a small.
Yeah.
But I got one
I
time.
noticed they have the nuggets that are like you get 2 10-piece nuggets for $5, or the 20-piece for $5.
Right. McDonald's is nothing if not
Doesn't,
precise with their math.
but it's I don't know.
The my favorite is
Doesn't add up.
my favorite though is when you go over there like with the app, because I use the app because I like to save money. Sometimes I go over there and I use the app and I don't even want 2 sandwiches, but I buy 2 sandwiches because I have the app. Just eat one, take one home.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody will eat it, or bring it here. Somebody will eat it. But every time I use the app, it's like I'm the first person that's ever gone into that McDonald's and ever used an app. Like they're like, hold on, what do I do? Wait, let me call the manager over. I'm not sure. It's not working. Like, no, it is working. You just don't want to give me that free sandwich.
Right. Between that and the ice cream machine that's always broken.
Oh man, don't get me started on that. Listen, McDonald's, I shouldn't eat your food. I really shouldn't. And I try not to. I've had very little McDonald's in recent months.
Oh, making it so delicious.
But don't mess around with me when I want $1 soft serve vanilla ice cream cone.
Well, they brought back the dollar menu, did they?
I don't know. Did they?
Hmm.
When I want that,
It used to be like the $1.29, whatever.
when I
value
want
menu.
that dollar or $1.20, whatever it is,
Right.
when I want that vanilla soft serve cone, just give it to me. I don't mess around when it comes to my ice cream.
It's true.
But anyway, we digress, as we always do. Let's get back into the discussion for tonight's show. And if you want to call in at any point with any questions, 508-996-0500, 877-996-1420. But we did have some questions that popped up in the chat room during the first hour and during the break. So we want to try and see if we can address those first. Matt, I'm just going to scroll through. So a question from James. They want to know if, we talked about King Philip's head being on a pike in Plymouth. Do they feel like Metacom, King Philip, do they feel like he haunts Plymouth?
Some people do say that he does, because in the area where it's been determined where his head was placed on a spike, it's located in Town Square. So down the hill from Burial Hill, there's an area that's right in front of the First Parish Meeting House, which is on the cover of my book, that they believe that that's where his head was. People have had very strong feelings of just desperation, fear, and something very, very negative is there. Could he be haunting Plymouth? He could. It's a tragedy and an irony that, as I mentioned earlier in the show, that his father was Massasoit, who brokered the peace with the Pilgrims, and that he would then be brought back after having been drawn and quartered, and also have his hand brought back as well to Plymouth as a symbol of.
And not to mention either, he felt that the Pilgrims killed his brother Wamsutta. Even though he supposedly died of the flu.
Right.
Like he always blamed them for his death. That's part of what kicked off the war.
Right.
So, he had a good reason to be angry and to not want to leave. And when we say that his head was on a pike in the middle of downtown Plymouth, we're not talking about like they put it out there and then when it started to stink, they said, let's go put it away. It was there for a long time.
It was there for 20 years.
That's a long time to have
That's
a head
a
on
very
a pike.
long time. And it sends a message.
Jeffrey Dahmer didn't keep heads around that much.
No,
that long.
he did not. But it definitely sends the message of don't mess with us. It's our place now. And look what we did to him, the leader. Just imagine what we'll do to you.
And, talking about some of these older stories, there's a lot of them. There's a lot of stuff that dates back to that era. There's a lot of stuff that comes through a lot of the colonial era. But Plymouth is a town that is still very much a living, breathing entity. And it's still holding in its ghosts. It's still collecting its ghost stories. One of my, I don't know if you covered it in the book, but one of my favorite haunted places in Plymouth, and a lot of people don't know about it, but then when I bring it up, they say, oh, yeah, I can see that. One of my favorite haunted locations in Plymouth is Cordage Park.
Aha. It is in the book.
Nice.
Yes. So Cordage Park was a place that was once called the Cordage Rope Company. And it was the largest manufacturer of rope in the world. It was a sprawling complex, multiple acres of buildings, train tracks, a dock, a couple of different docks. So this was, they supplied rope to the world for rigging, for anything that you could ever imagine that rope is used for. So thousands and thousands of people and generations of families worked at the Cordage Company. And it was around for about 150 years. So one can imagine from its earliest beginnings, it's a very industrial place. It's a very industrial business. And workers would be working in conditions that might not have always been the safest conditions. There are stories about that I heard a lot of stories, let me put it this way, about hauntings in the train tunnel. hauntings in the main cottage building of an elevator going up and down, or the voices of workers late at night. People would hear music late at night. There's also the story of what people believe to be the screams and cries of a small child coming from one of the smokestacks. So I met with the person who had been the general manager of the property for decades and asked him his opinion about whether any of Cordage was haunted. And he told me the story about, that in any place, working in such conditions, it could be dangerous. He wasn't aware of any child that would ever have been sent into a smokestack to clean it. Most likely, that's not true. He said that the noise that was being heard late at night by different people, security guards, was probably noise coming from the Black Raspberry pub. Elevators operating on their own, someone could have pressed the button, walked away. So those stories he wasn't so keen on, that it was haunted. But he did tell me a story that makes a lot of sense about the train tunnel. So the trains would operate by an engineer and workers who would check to see where in a tunnel where they would have to make sure that another train wasn't coming in the tunnel when they were entering the tunnel. So the trains would run from the docks to the factory and from the factory to the docks. So it was critical that before entering the tunnel, the engineers send a worker to check to make sure that that tunnel was clear so that they could pass. There is a story about one of the engineers, and reportedly he was under the influence of alcohol at the time. He did hit one of the workers, and a worker was killed in the train tunnel at the Cordage. So there could be a haunting of the tunnel of someone who was killed in such a tragic and dangerous way. There's also a story about one of the office buildings at Cordage Park. It's now an office building. It was what they called the recreation center. Attached to that was the Cordage Park commissary that was called Harris Hall. Over the years, after Cordage Park closed down as a rope manufacturer, the buildings have served different purposes. They've either been torn down, they either remain and they're storage facilities, or they become a different business, as with the office building that's a separate entity now from the Cordage Company. In 1992, there were 2 abductions of young women from the facility of the recreation center, from the stairs of the facility of the recreation center. One of them, women, tragically was murdered inside of the old Harris Hall building. Ooh. Yes, and that was connected to the recreation center. Very tragic tale. It was the man who did this is now in jail for the rest of his life. But there were reports in the office building at the office that was connected to the entrance to that Harris Hall area. There were reports of electronics just going haywire. Printers printing on their own, and not just one printer. There would be a printer that would malfunction and print on its own blank sheets of paper. The staff in the office called in their tech person to check on this. There was nothing wrong with the printer. They ended up having to get a new printer, and the same thing would happen. So the staff members in this particular office have also reported hearing shrieks and cries in late at night, if they've had to stay late. They hear that off in the direction of where Harris Hall once stood. Harris Hall no longer stands. It was torn down after this incident. So there could very well be ghosts that haunt the vast complex of the Cordage Company.
Well, I'm here to tell you firsthand that there are. When I was younger, in the 80s, when I was living in Plymouth, Cordage Park was kind of a I don't want to say happening place, but there was a lot of activity there, a lot of stores, and we would often go there and do shopping and what have you. And it must have been the early 90s because we were already living in Wareham, but my dad used to have a flea market table that he would go to different flea markets and sell auto parts. And they had a flea market at Cordage Park for a little while, and we were there, and I just remember it always being super dark inside of there. But anyway, I remember that the person who was in charge of the building, and this was in the not the main Cordage Park building where where the pub is and all that stuff, but the long building heading toward the now vacant Walmart. But in that middle section, they had the flea market, and the person that was in charge of the building gave me $5 to go walk around and open up all the doors in the main building. So I went in there, and one of the first things that I did is I had to use the restroom. So I went to, and if anybody's ever been in Cordage Park, the restrooms are kind of weird in there. It's like a long hallway that you walk into, and then there's stalls that have like tall doors. So when you're in the stall, you're closed in. And I went into the bathroom and I closed the door, and it was a sit-down affair. So as I sat down, I could hear the door to the bathroom close. And I'm like, but I haven't opened any of the doors yet. Who followed me into the bathroom? And I'm just thinking to myself, some weirdo is coming into the bathroom with me, and I can't see when they're coming because of the doors. You can't see underneath to see people's feet or what have you. And then I hear the other doors to the other stalls kind of banging. And I'm like, it's coming toward me, but nothing happened. And so when I open the door and I go out, there's nobody in there. And at this time, I'm not thinking anything paranormal or anything ghosts. But as I'm walking around, I'm just feeling like there's somebody watching me, like there's somebody following me. And I keep turning around and there's nobody behind me. And I just run through and I open up all those doors and I ran back. But it made me think of a story from when I was younger. And when you were talking before about hearing the singing and hearing the voices, I remember being in Cordage Park, and they have the elevator in the middle, but they also have that staircase next to it. And I was going up the staircase or coming down, but I was on the stairs, and all of a sudden I heard music, singing, coming out of nowhere. And it wasn't music coming over the system. It wasn't anything like that. And I remember saying something to my dad about it, and he was, I don't know if he was just joking with me or what, but I just had metal fillings put in. And so he's like, oh, your metal fillings are probably picking up the radio station. But I lived way closer to the WPLM towers than I was when I was at Cordage Park. So I would think that if my fillings were going to rattle from the radio, it would be when I was at home and I was closer to it. And so I never really put that thought into my head until you mentioned that maybe what I heard was some of that kind of that fan. Because I definitely, would not be surprised if somebody heard voices in there. I'm sure I heard whispering when I was running around in there. But it's definitely a place where I got super freaked out. So bad that I didn't even go back there for a number of years.
Wow.
So
that really affected you.
It did. I mean, and usually that kind of stuff doesn't freak me out, but it took them opening up a record store, and me wanting to go in there and find some old records for me to actually go there. It was, the guy had all the import CDs and all that stuff. And I was like, well, I got to go get these CDs and I can't get them anywhere else. So I guess I have to go to Cordage Park. But even that Walmart, I would never go there.
Wow.
Now they've moved the Walmart.
Yes, they've torn down the Walmart. It is now really a vital Cordage Park, even though it's haunted, is and remains a very vital part of the community because it's now home to doctors' offices, restaurants.
There's
they're
new
building
ownership.
a new they're building a new medical center. They have a marina there. There's a T stop there, so people can take the train to and from Boston. So it's a really vital part of the community.
And it's a fantastic location. And when you're there and you're going there, you're like, why can't they do any more with this than they did? And maybe they've kind of finally broken out of that curse of what was there for so long. But it's certainly a great place to go and walk around and hang out and just go and see for yourself. And it is stepping right back into history.
Right.
And for those of you who don't know, the Walmart that was there at the time was, if I remember right, was the only Walmart in the country that looked different than every other Walmart. They got a special, they had to have a special arrangement with Walmart to come in there that it had to look like Cordage Park. It had to be a brick building that looked like it fit in. So they couldn't just build it like the regular Walmarts they do everywhere else. And then they go through all that trouble and say, hey, we're going to go move across town now. But,
interesting factoid.
Yeah, but even that area, I mean, even the area where Colony Place is and all that stuff that they have now, you know, I grew up not that far from there, and that was, a lot of that was all woods and, you know, back road stuff. And Route 44 was nothing like it was then. When you went down Route 44, especially at night, it was freaky.
Yes. Yes, it was a rural route, and now it's a major highway. And we still refer to it in Plymouth as the new 44 and the old 44.
Right. Is there a place now that, you know, there's all these historical stories, but is there a place with a haunting that you can think of that's a more recent story, like a more recent maybe tragedy that affected it, something from like the 70s, 80s, 90s era?
Yes, I can tell you that in the late 90s, there was a terrible murder on Leyden Street. Now, Leyden Street was the street where, when the Pilgrims left the fort, they built their houses on Leyden Street. So it's one of the oldest streets in America. Very historic, lovely mansions line the street today, and there's a hill that goes straight down to the water. In one of those houses in the late 1990s lived a man and a woman in a house that had been converted into apartments. Suddenly, the wife disappeared. She was supposed to go to a party and then appear at work. She worked locally, and she didn't arrive, and she didn't show up at work. During that time, her husband disappeared as well. So she was missing for 3 months.
Whoa.
3 months, and they had searched the apartment. They had searched the entire house. As I mentioned, it's a number of apartments in that house. There are a number of apartments in that house. They had searched the attic. They had tried to track her through credit cards. The husband was on the run. They were able to track him and find him. But that's after they eventually found her up in the attic. He had murdered her and hid her in the attic, hid her so well that even the police couldn't find her for those 3 months.
Wow.
They eventually caught him because he was using her credit cards. He was gambling. He was down in New Jersey gambling, and that's where they eventually found him. And they tracked him because someone recognized that his name, because there was a warrant out for his arrest, and they were just about to do a special on America's Most Wanted to try to find him. So he was brought back to Massachusetts. What was interesting about what people would eventually experience, people who lived in that apartment, was that the couple had all sorts of different videotapes back in the era of videotapes, and many of them,
they weren't that far from Video Paradise, where I used to get my videotapes.
Right. That's right. But they had a collection of videos of the television show Little House on the Prairie, and supposedly this was the woman's favorite show on TV. People who later moved into that particular apartment would experience their television going on by itself. They did not press the clicker or turn the TV set on, and when it went on to the show Little House on the Prairie.
Wow. Which, by the way, isn't really on television all that much anymore. So That's extra freaky. Now, Leiden is one of those streets on the hills that come off of Samoset, right? What is with the hills in that area? They seem to have, it's almost like there's a geomagnetic power to them.
There could be. There very well could be. I mean, we know that what is in the earth, rocks, stones, quartz, metals, they all attract energies and shift energies. So Plymouth is a place that's very, very hilly. It's ups and downs and groves and grooves, and so the terrain itself is like that, where there's rock, sand, land, pine barrens.
One of the freakiest places, and it's beautiful. Don't get me wrong. But it also just creeps me out to be there is the Forefathers Monument. And I haven't been to the top of the Standish Monument in Duxbury, but I've heard it's kind of the similar feel, and that there seems to be, it's almost like the Forefathers Monument is some kind of a beacon to whatever is out there, because if it's just creepy.
It's interesting that you should say that about the Forefathers Monument, because there is a house that I wrote about in the book. I interviewed an individual who reported that he had seen and experienced a haunting at a house that is on that street, and his friend, it was a childhood friend who lived there, that friend and his family experienced terrifying apparitions. And it was so bad that they moved. They left overnight. They just could not take the hauntings anymore. One of a tall and slender man, a vision that would walk through the room. He was menacing looking. And noises, slamming doors, unexplainable noises, just terrifying visions that they experienced. It's a house very close to the Forefathers Monument.
Doesn't surprise me at all. Like I said, it's beautiful. When you walk around it and you read all the inscriptions and you realize what it's there for, it's phenomenal. But at the same time, my dad used to work early mornings, and sometimes I would go with him and we'd be riding around, and that was like one of those spots where you didn't even want to look at it if the sun wasn't up yet. Like driving by it, it was kind of like, all right, I know it's there. I know that she's standing there. And it's still, if I'm driving, like when, you're driving around at night and you want to kind of creep yourself out a little bit, you take a little stroll by, a little ride by, you park the car, maybe run up, dare yourself to run up and then run back. But it certainly definitely has a power. Now, I think when people hear about Plymouth and they think about Plymouth, a lot of people look at Plymouth Plantation and they say, here's an area that, is reaching back into history, but it's more of a modern recreation of what it was. It's not like you're dealing with buildings that are authentic to the time period. They're just recreations of that. But Plymouth Plantation has a lot of reputation of having activity around it. And I'm assuming a lot of that could also include more modern era stuff too. Yes.
Well, I did, in the earlier hour of the show talk about Clark's Garrison. And it has been reported that in that area there are shrieks and cries and just a general dismal feeling. Plymouth Plantation itself is a well-researched reproduction living history museum and attraction, and everyone should go there and experience a Thanksgiving dinner there. So all through the month of November,
Listen, the sister station to our station, Fun 107, they were actually over there on Thanksgiving morning, but they didn't bother to bring anything back for the AM side at all. But, but I have heard that the meals there are phenomenal.
Yes, it's a terrific experience. And if you want to, interact with living history characters who are playing actual people that we know of in history, Winslow, White, Bradford, Alice Southworth. It's really a fascinating experience. Other places, if you're interested in, apart from hauntings, but where you can get the real history of Plymouth and Plymouth Colony, everyone should visit Pilgrim Hall Museum and really see the Pilgrim story and the Native American story through the real artifacts of the Pilgrims. So I think those are two things. If people haven't done that, they should check them off their to-do list or their bucket list.
And speaking of Plymouth Plantation and the interpretations there, a good friend of the show, Tim Turner, is one of the Native interpreters there, and he also runs the Native Plymouth tours. And we've been trying to get him on for years to talk about the Native American ghost story. So we'll get him on sometime. It's very hard to get anyone from the Wampanoag tribe to come on and talk about that because it's considered taboo for them to share those stories with outsiders.
Yes, that's true. But Tim does a terrific Native Plymouth tour, walking tour that people should take. I have taken that tour before and really learned some nuggets of information that I hadn't heard before.
There was one, I guess the chief of the tribe a couple years ago. It was probably about 10 years ago now. I made arrangements through email, and I think we even talked on the phone for him to come on the show. And originally he was going to come in, and then he changed his mind and said he just wanted to do it over the phone. And he was going to come on and share some Native American ghost stories with us and supernatural stories. And it got to be the night of the show, and 9 o'clock. So we come on the air at 10 o'clock. So it's about 9 o'clock. I'm hitting the highway on my way here. And my phone rings, and it's him. And he says, listen, I just can't do it. I'm getting too much pressure from others, from the other elders. I can't do it. And so it just amazes me how much, and it was like this with, and I'm sure you dealt with it, with a lot of any of the ghost stories in Plymouth. People hold on to them so tightly, and they kind of didn't want to share them with the outside world. I'm sure that, being part of that historical community gave you that leg in that an outsider wouldn't have been able to get.
Yes, I think that helped. I do think it helped because people do hold on to those stories. And, is it a cultural difference with the Native American culture? Yes. We're a little, I think, in Plymouth, in the historical community, they're cautious about the stories that are out there because, as I mentioned when I was researching this book, we want to be able to tie the stories to a real incident, a real person. We just don't want it to be folklore or urban myth because that mixes up history too much for people. So with that said, another place that people should, when they're visiting Plymouth, that they should check out is the Spire Center for the Performing Arts. There's a show almost every night, whether it's musical show, different acts that perform there, or whether it's a play or a dance show. There's something there for everyone. It's a great place to be on an evening in Plymouth. But that is a very haunted building.
And that's, which building is that in?
It's called the Spire Center, and it's on the corner of Brewster Street and Court Street. It is a former Methodist church, and it was purchased by the town to serve as a performing arts center. The Methodists were, they're known for singing and music, and they built this with the most wonderful acoustics. So it's a treasured building, beautiful to look at, great place to see a show, but indeed very haunted. And the story of the hauntings of the Spire Center are in this book, first-hand accounts from people who work there.
Did you cover Station 1 in the book?
I did cover Station 1. Station 1 is now the Sam Diego's Mexican Eatery. Great place to go to eat, have a margarita. I interviewed one of the bartenders, and she told me stories that would raise the hair up on the back of your neck. A dog spotted in the basement, just strange happenings. People would be terrified to go downstairs in the basement, yet they have to because they have to work the taps down in the basement. But just strange occurrences in Station 1.
It's funny because I remember when it still was a fire station, I think, when I was a kid, but they turned it into the Station 1 restaurant before it was San Diego's. And I remember reading something about this, grand opening and everything, and there was just a little throwaway line in the story about how, they're not even paying attention to rumors that it's haunted. I was like, what the what? Like, this is something that people are putting in newspapers? But so, you can't help it in Plymouth.
You can't help it in Plymouth, and in particular with those buildings. So those buildings on Court Street, Main Street, North Street, they're all connected underground.
Oh, wow.
Yes. Now, you can look through in some of the basements, and I mentioned Mercy Otis Warren's house, which is included in this book, The Collection of Ghost Stories, with James Warren being the vision that someone saw in the house. But they're connected because of pipes that run through, and so you can look in some of the basements and see other buildings' basements. So energies moving through buildings and basements, I think that really happens in those buildings.
And let's not forget either that, the water is right there. So that's going to help power up a lot of this stuff. And even though you've got the ocean right there, in that area, people don't realize this. There's a lot of running brooks and little rivers and creeks and stuff that's all kind of flowing through there. I mean, everything that's downtown, the water is flowing underneath there, heading down into Brewster Gardens. There's definitely an amping up of the energies there.
That's correct, yes. And it's reported, and I interviewed someone for the book, and this story is in the book, about shadow people walking up and down North Street, that they're just going about their business. It's as if it's a residual haunting, people doing their regular day-to-day activities, walking up and down North Street, that they have been seen as shadow people.
Is there, we might have covered it, but do you have a favorite ghost story of Plymouth?
That's a good question. I think one of my favorite ghost stories is of the Captain Thompson Phillips house. That house is the only house in Massachusetts that has been given the moniker as officially haunted. It's also one of Plymouth's earliest hauntings as well, but there was a major court case that happened where the owner of the building, he was renting it out to tenants, where he sued his tenants for defamation. And the court came back and said, you can't say that a house is not haunted. If your tenants fled and left you high and dry because they were afraid of the noises and the spirits and the experiences in the house, then they're not slandering you. They were truly afraid, and that house is haunted. So I described the entire experience and the witnesses that would see a pale bluish light in the window, and the different things that would happen, the rapping of canes on the walls and groaning noises. It's all described in the book.
And is there a museum in that building?
I think you're referring to the Taylor Trask Museum.
Yes.
This house is on Middle Street, and it is currently a 5-unit apartment building.
But the Trask Museum has a haunting in it as well.
It does indeed, yes. It's the haunted preambulator or buggy.
Yeah. I've never understood what a pram is. I'm like, it's
pram.
It's a buggy. That's what it is.
It's a buggy. It's a baby buggy that moves on its own. Yes.
You got to love some of these stories because it's, it could be the least little thing, but it ties into a bigger overall picture. And that's the thing about, we look at a lot of town, not to plug myself here, but I'm wearing the shirt right now. I worked on a show called Haunted Towns, and we look at places where we say, where does all the activity that's happening in all these hauntings seem to have a center connection? And Plymouth is one of those places where it doesn't have to be all relating to the Pilgrims. It doesn't have to be all but there's some sort of center power that is powering up all of these hauntings. And that's why I say, getting back into that, chicken or the egg thing, there's something there. There's something there that is keeping these stories alive, keeping these hauntings active, keeping people experiencing these, because I do think that you have to experience a haunting for it to actually be a true thing that happens. And it's making sure that, these stories will never go away.
Right. And I think that there's an energy about Plymouth that I've never experienced anywhere else. There are times when it's a very negative energy, that there's something negatively pervasive. Then there's a time that it's a very excitable energy. There's so much to do and so much going on in Plymouth. It's a place where there's lots of entertainment venues. It's a place where people want to come to visit. Millions of people from around the world come every year to visit Plymouth.
There was just 200,000 people at the parade.
At the parade, of really, one
That's
of the
like
best.
Macy's parade numbers.
It's it's a little bit less than Macy parade numbers, but I can tell you this is something that you should see if you haven't been to the Plymouth Thanksgiving parade. It's the weekend before Thanksgiving, and it is the chronological history of Plymouth represented in that parade, and it's such a good time, great for families.
One of my favorite spots, in just a few minutes that we have left, I just want to ask you, one of my favorite places to go in Plymouth and just spend time, I mentioned how I just love to go to Burial Hill, but another place that I'd love to go to is the Jenny Gristmill area.
Yes.
Is any ghost stories that have come out of there?
No, I don't have any ghost stories about the Jenny Gristmill area, but do go to the Jenny Gristmill and Lucioso's pub, particularly on a sunny day, because you can sit outside and you can sit by the wheel as it's turning, the water wheel, and just have that soothing sound of that wheel in the water. It's a really great experience.
I have not been since they've become that location. I went when it was run of the mill, and they had the best burgers that I'd ever had anywhere. But I love to just pack a picnic. When my son was little, we'd pack a picnic and we'd go there, and people don't really discover the fact that you can walk over to the other little island and spend time there. But that's why I'm glad. I never found any ghost stories there either, so I'm glad you didn't either, because it's a nice, peaceful place to go and get away from the ghosts that are everywhere else.
Yes.
In Plymouth.
Yes. Very haunted. Plymouth is very haunted. North, south, east, west. Indeed.
And that's we really only covered kind of the downtown area. I mean, Plymouth is so sprawling, and I know that South Plymouth has a lot, because I live close to South Plymouth. There's a lot of roads where you want to make sure that you have your high beams on and somebody in the passenger seat with you while you're going down the road, because it's just that freaky. So much more that we can cover, and we'll definitely have you back again to talk more. But tomorrow, people can come out and see you in person. They can meet you. They can pick up the book. They can share their own stories with you. Let everybody know where you're going to be tomorrow.
I'll be at the Seaport Inn tomorrow at the Beautiful Collective's Holiday Fair. It runs from 11 to 4. I will be signing and selling books, and I'd be happy to personalize a book to anyone. Great for holiday presents for people, and great as a keepsake of your own. And
we have a lot of listeners in this area who are, not just interested in the idea of the paranormal. Even to the show, it's not just about the ghosts. People love history, and they love something like this where, and I know just by talking with you and hearing your background, that the history was just as important to you as it was telling the ghost story. It was the same for me with Ghosts of the South Coast. I said, the history is so good, it's overshadowing the ghosts, which is fine, because that's just the way that it ended up working out. And that's what's missing, is being able to tell the true story of the history without the whitewashing and without the biases that we find in history books, and to be able to kind of share the story and to have the ghosts kind of be the humanity that connects it all together. Right. As I mentioned earlier in the show, these are human stories. They're experienced by real people who truly believe that they were affected by something, a spectral spirit, an apparition, a sound, a feeling, a noise, a smell. So really human stories, and about humans. And even one of the stories, when I write in my chapter, Houses of the Downtown, I worked with a psychic, and we determined that one very haunted house could indeed be haunted by an animal spirit. Oh. Do you name the psychic in the book? I do. Is it anybody I know? It's Patrice Delory Hatcher. She also served as my photographer
So the book has vintage postcards representing Plymouth's history and some of the sites and stories in the book, as well as historically important and significant photographs.
And how can people follow along with you online, and how can they get the book online?
Sure. Well, I have a Facebook page. I urge you to like and follow. It's called Ghosts of Plymouth, Massachusetts, Author and Book Events. So go to Facebook and follow me there. The book is also available online at Arcadia Publishing, Amazon, Nook, Google Play, iBooks, Kobo, and it's in bookstores locally in Plymouth at the Yankee Book and Art Gallery on North Street in Plymouth, and at the Barnes & Noble in Hyannis, at Westwind Bookstore in Duxbury, and at many of the gift shops around Plymouth as well.
And I'm going to bet that the Sea Witch has it in Fairhaven here, and probably Barnes & Noble in Dartmouth. But the easiest way to get it is just to come and see you tomorrow. And
exactly. Come see me tomorrow.
Get it right from the author, get it signed, share your stories, hear some stories. And I got to put on my acquisitions editor hat now for a minute, because I'm sure they're already contacting you with the success of this book. Are you looking toward another area that you want to tell some more ghost stories from?
There may indeed be another book. Yeah. I'm not at liberty to say, but keep watch, because I will announce in a month or so.
I'll tell you off the air about the one that I pitched to the History Press a couple years ago, and they still are interested in it, but I don't know. I'm having a hard time getting a lot of the stories, but I'll tell you that off the air. Well, we thank Darcy Lee for coming in and joining us, braving this storm, although it looks like it's subsided pretty well. Thank you for coming in, and we promise that if we call you again, we will make sure that Mother Nature makes it just as spooky when you come back and join us the next time.
Terrific.
Tomorrow you should have a nice day, though. So everybody can come on down to the Seaport Inn and meet Darcy, get the book. It makes a great Christmas gift, and it doesn't matter if you're into the paranormal. It doesn't matter if you're into history. There's a part of it for everybody. So absolutely 100%. I can't think of anybody that wouldn't appreciate getting a book. And who doesn't love getting a real actual book on Christmas? Opening it up and thumbing through the pages and all that. And then just curling up on the couch with the fireplace going and starting the book. Well, we're going to be back next week. I don't know who our guest is yet, because we're booking the show now, so that means it'll be on the fly, as we always do. But we'll be back next Saturday night with another edition of the show. You can always follow our adventures on YouTube. You can find the video of this show and every other show that we've done. And you can find the podcast everywhere the podcasts are found. Reach out to us, Spooky Crew at SpookySouthCoast.com. We want to know who you are, where you're listening from, how you listen, what you think of the show, how you think we can make it better, which one of us you think is the best looking person. That's cool too. If you want to put that down, we're going to lose that. That's going to go to Stephanie. It's not even worth running a poll. But anything that you want to reach out with us to, Spooky Crew at SpookySouthCoast.com. That's the way. Follow us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at SpookySC. Follow us on Instagram. We're everywhere. Wherever you are, you'll find Spooky South Coast. So join up with us in those different ways. And as I mentioned, we'll be back next week. We'll have more paranormal topics to discuss with you. I think Ashley will probably be back next week with the Week in Weird. She was a little under the weather this week, so we gave her the week off. But we'll have some more weird stories for you coming up next week. And, of course, whatever you want to bring to the table, let us know all week long. This is your show. We're just the monkeys that come in and press the buttons. That's the way that we look at it. So until next week, we want you all to stay spooktacular.